Your Eminence, many thanks for your kind words of introduction. Thank you for inviting me to this Synaxis, which is a great privilege for me, and I'm happy to help the diocese in its work. From the side of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute, which I also represent here. I also thank Father John Bacchus for hospitality, for your hospitality last year when I indeed was here, and today. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate your presence here, all brothers in Christ, and I'll try not to disappoint you very much with my presentation. I'm very thankful to Your Eminence for suggesting the topic for today's talk, which you wanted to be more practical, more pastoral, and I'll try to make my conversation as pastoral as possible. Because indeed the issue of the Oriental churches is not just a theoretical issue, it is a practical issue. For some, it is really a theological matter. And some people delve into the discussions regarding Oriental churches or other Eastern Christian traditions. It's not just about Oriental church, but it's also about the Church of the East, which we sometimes associate with Nestorianism. And they're also here. For many, it's just a theological issue, but in some contexts, it is a very big practical issue, particularly in the context like Southern California, where the climate is mild, where the climate is close to Mediterranean, where most people from the Oriental traditions come from as refugees or as immigrants. The area of Los Angeles, Southern California, I know that you face this, has a lot of people from the Middle East, a lot of people from those Eastern Christian traditions that I've just mentioned. Because they like warm weather. They try to settle where it is warmer. Even though it's interesting, my previous experience was from Sweden. I worked before I came to LMU. I worked for Theological Academy of St. Ignatius in Sweden, and actually in Sweden we had over 200,000 refugees from the Middle East. Only in Sweden. It's more than the US and Canada invited and hosted refugees from Iraq and Syria altogether. So in Sweden it is much more, and many of them are Christians. Many of them come from the Christian communities. And actually in Sweden it's interesting that the Orientals constitute the majority among the minority of the Eastern Christians. They're really huge, and the Byzantine tradition is really tiny there, which constitutes a big ecclesial problem. It's not just a pastoral problem. How to collaborate with them? We are accustomed to the idea that they are minor to us. It's a sort of complex, if you want, of superiority. But in such contexts as Sweden, they are the majority. They are more than us, and we need to take them into consideration. I know that this is particularly a concern and a kind of thing that His Eminence Metropolitan Cleopas of Sweden takes into consideration, has to take into consideration, because on the one hand he leads the Byzantine kind of church in Sweden, on the other hand he has to rely on the group which is much larger than the Byzantine group. In Sweden they have, I think, the largest cathedral in the world, the Syrian Christians, larger than any church that they have in Syria or in Iraq. So it's really a big issue. It's a pastoral issue, it is an ecclesial issue, it is an ecumenical issue. I will begin with exploring identities, because identities seem to be very important in this issue. Identities seem to be more important than theology, unfortunately. So how do we identify them, and how do they identify us? Before the era of the dialogues, of the ecumenical dialogues, the common perception among the Orientals about us was that we are Nestorians. They firmly believed, and many of them still believe, that we are Nestorians. And we do believe, and much more used to believe, that they are Monophysites. Both identities are completely wrong. And actually the dialogues helped us to deconstruct those identities, to realize that they are not Monophysites and we are not Nestorians. That was a huge outcome of the dialogue. This is the construction of identities. We know how we identify ourselves. We identify ourselves not as Nestorians, but as Chalcedonians, and we condemn Nestorians. But exactly in the same way as we condemn Nestorianism, they condemn Monophysitism. Monophysitism, in the terms of kind of historical accuracy, is a heresy which was condemned by the Fourth Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon in the year 451, and it had a leader, this group. Its leader was Eutyches, who was an archimandrite, a kind of a bishop for monks in the area of Constantinople. And his teaching was completely wrong and was condemned by the church as wrong, because Eutyches taught that the humanity of Christ after the incarnation transformed into something that is different from our humanity. It changed, and it became more spiritual. Somehow this idea reflected the monastic kind of practices of the area. It came from some wrong spiritual exercises and perceptions. When people confused the nature with the sin, when people thought that what they see as sinfulness in the human being is a part of the human nature. Therefore, Christ could not have this nature, and this nature changed into something different, which from what we are. This idea was condemned by the Council of Chalcedon, and actually exactly the same teaching was condemned by what we call Monophysites, who are not Monophysites, the Orientals. They condemn Eutyches. They condemn the idea that the humanity of Jesus Christ changed to something different. They believe together with us that Christ is doubly consubstantial. He is consubstantial with the Father according to his divinity, and he is consubstantial with us according to his humanity. That his humanity is not changed, it is the same. In this regard, they teach the same that St. Cyril of Alexandria taught. St. Cyril of Alexandria is a common father for us and for them. He is the common platform, as he is the common platform for the entire Eastern Christology. There is more difference in the Christology between the Byzantine Church and the Roman Catholic Church than in the Christology between the Orientals and us, in a sense, because for us and for the Orientals, Cyril is just in the center of our Christological thinking, while for the Catholics it's Pope Leo, who was more about the duality in Christ, while Cyril of Alexandria, his main point was that Christ is one single being, and that is the common platform for us and for the Orientals. The historical reasons why we separated was the hermeneutics, the interpretation of Cyril of Alexandria. Two groups of the disciples of Cyril argued with each other. One group took Cyril's wording literally, and they did not want to use the language of two natures regarding Jesus Christ, something that Cyril did not use either. Cyril did not use the language of two natures. He used the language of one nature. Mia physis theologos archomeni was his central phrase, one nature of Jesus Christ which is incarnated. And the Severans, the group which venerated Cyril as their main saint, as their main chief theologian, interpreted literally what Cyril of Alexandria said. So that this duality in Jesus Christ, they accepted duality in Jesus Christ. They said that yes, indeed, Christ has humanity and has divinity, but that that duality they called one nature, mia physis. While other group of the followers of Cyril, who also venerated him absolutely, completely as the main theologian, the theologian number one in the church, they interpreted his language a bit differently, more creatively, I would say. They interpreted his language as if Cyril of Alexandria was saying about two natures. And that's actually what Chalcedon, the Council of Chalcedon, adopted. The Council of Chalcedon became an interpretative tool towards Cyril of Alexandria. Chalcedon is, in a sense, secondary to Cyril. It's not that Chalcedon said something which was the new thing. No. Chalcedon, the job of Chalcedon was to interpret Cyril of Alexandria, and its interpretation was more creative than the interpretation of the other group, which was led by Severus of Antioch, the Patriarch Severus of Antioch, who became the main theologian of the group which we know now as Orientals. So the common ground of the Orientals and us, the Byzantines, was common veneration of St. Cyril and his theology, common rejection of Eutyches and of Nestorianism. We agreed from the beginning on those matters. What we disagreed upon was the way how we interpreted, perceived Cyril of Alexandria, the language that we used. They preferred the language of miaphysis, something that Cyril used himself. That's why now they identify themselves as miaphysites. They really hate the word monophysites. It's really pejorative. It's not nice to call them monophysites. It's not just true, it's not nice. But they prefer to call themselves miaphysites. You say there is no much difference between monophysites, miaphysites is the same. In Greek it is the same, but it's now a matter of identity. So miaphysites is an identity which is acceptable for them, and monophysites is an identity which we often ascribed to them, which was not true and which actually insults them. We commonly agree, I just want to summarize, that Eutyches was a heretic, that monophysitism is heresy, that Nestorianism is heresy, that Cyril of Alexandria is the theologian number one for us, and that constitutes the common ground for us. Actually, this common ground was explored by the emperors and theologians in the century that followed Chalcedon in order to bridge the two groups which actually descended from each other more and more. They separated, departed from each other more and more. The huge populations in Egypt and Syria disliked Chalcedon, and they decided that they don't want to subscribe to the theology which was articulated, to the language effectively, which was articulated by Chalcedon. And they actually, and it was not just a theological issue, it was a political issue, because those populations collaborated with the Persians. The Persian Empire was the eternal enemy of the Roman Empire. Simeon Simokata used to say that the world had two eyes, the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And those eyes hated each other. They were always enemies, and the Persians always tried to occupy the Roman Empire. And the Persians used the dissatisfaction of the people in Egypt and in Syria to advance to the Byzantine soil. So it became a big political issue, and the emperors began thinking how to bridge those gaps, the gap which was widening between two interpretations of St. Cyril of Alexandria effectively. And they invented a device which is now called in science Neo-Chalcedonianism. It's a movement which was initiated by Justinian, effectively, who was the main promoter of Neo-Chalcedonianism. And among the main figures of Neo-Chalcedonianism were Maximus the Confessor, John of Damascus, Leontius of Byzantium, and the main council of the Neo-Chalcedonians, which supported, confirmed Neo-Chalcedonianism, was the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So the Fifth Ecumenical Council is the council of Neo-Chalcedonianism. Neo-Chalcedonianism tried to synthesize back the language of Chalcedon and the language of Cyril. Effectively, Neo-Chalcedonianism stated that we can use both languages. We can use the language of one nature and the language of two natures. And Maximus, the Confessor, used to say that I can say that Christ is one nature, and I can say that Christ is two natures. It's not important what I say, it's important what I mean by that. That was the point of Maximus, and that was the main kind of idea of Neo-Chalcedonianism. Neo-Chalcedonianism worked only partially. Only some groups of the Orientals reunited with the Byzantine Church. And eventually, with the passage of time, the Oriental Church departed even further and created its own fellowship, its own church, which we now know as the Fellowship of the Oriental Churches. In a sense, the idea of fellowship is very common to the Eastern Christianity, and it is contrary to the monarchical principle of the Western Church. And it's another feature that unites us. In the Western Church, particularly in the Catholic Church, as you well know, the local churches are united under the primacy of the Pope. And this union is not by consent. It is a union, if you want, by coercion. The fellowship of the Eastern churches is based on consent. It means that every church participates in the fellowship and shares ideas, initiatives by consent, if the church chooses to. It means that no single church can force another church to participate in an initiative. The first among our churches, the Church of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, may come up with initiatives, with the ideas how to work together, how to speak together with one voice. But this relationship between us, between local churches, is consensual. It's like in a human relationship, in a family, we work together by consent. It is really hard. It is very difficult. It is very troublesome. And sometimes we blame ourselves as Orthodox. Well, we always argue with each other. We cannot, work as one single body. But we have a treasure behind that. It is a bad thing, but it's actually because we have much more precious, something which is more precious, the system which is based on consent of the churches. And this is a thing which makes our relationship in the Orthodox Church, I think, more advanced than even in the Western Church. With all the niceties and great things that the Western Church, the Catholic Church has, they don't have this consensual relationship between the churches. They are forced to do things which they are told to do by the Bishop of Rome. I had last July. I had a wonderful meeting with His All Holiness in Constantinople, and we touched also, among many other things, the issue of the dialogues. And he showed how disappointed he actually was with many pan-Orthodox initiatives. It is a huge pain. It is a huge burden to shepherd cats, the local churches. It's not just us who shepherd cats in the parishes, but it's also the Ecumenical Patriarch who has to shepherd cats, which sometimes choose not to participate in the initiatives of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But he cannot do anything similar to what the Pope, say, in Rome can do. That is a burden, that is a responsibility, that is a huge thing. And still, with all those disappointments, particularly in the context of the Pan-Orthodox Council, which not all the churches attended, the Ecumenical Patriarch still carries this cross, this heavy cross. So we have fellowships. The same fellowship have the Oriental churches. There is an Oriental fellowship, just as we have a fellowship. So they're also based on the principle of consent, of consensus. And that is their difference from the Western Church. That is something that unites us, that makes us closer, that we work according to the same principle of consent. However, I would not say that they have a church which would be similar to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Their fellowship is slightly different. I would say that it is looser than our fellowship. I mentioned the dialogue. The dialogue is really great, the dialogue that we have had with them. The main dialogue that we have is the Pan-Orthodox dialogue. That is the earliest Pan-Orthodox dialogue that we ever had with any church, and that is the most successful dialogue that we had. The dialogue began unofficially in 1964 in Aarhus in Denmark. That was the first unofficial meeting. Effectively, it was soon after the first meeting in Rhodes, in the island of Rhodes, which actually laid foundations for the ecumenical activities of the Orthodox Church, and it was the first fruit of the first meetings in Rhodes. other dialogues, including the dialogues with the Catholic Church, with the Lutherans and so forth, Anglicans, they started later, after the dialogue with the Oriental Church. And as I said, that is the most successful dialogue because it concluded. It formally concluded with signing a declaration, common declaration. Actually, there were two declarations. One declaration was signed in 1989 in Egypt, Anba Bishoy Monastery. And the other declaration was signed in the Center of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Chambézy in Switzerland in 1990. So that declaration concluded the dialogue. The sides who participated in the dialogue, they agreed that there are no theological differences between our churches. No reasons anymore that had led us to divisions in the 5th century. Okay. Probably I have to say a few words about the kitchen of this declaration. It was from the Orthodox side. I think the main drafters of the declaration were Father John Romanidis and Vlasios Fidas. And Professor Fidas told me personally, and then I realized when I studied this declaration that it is indeed based on the ideas of Neo-Chalcedonianism, on that bridge between the language of Chalcedon and the language of Cyril of Alexandria that was produced by people like Justinian and confirmed by the Fifth Ecumenical Council. Actually, what they did, they took the language of the Neo-Chalcedonian theologians and put it to the Declaration of Chambézy in 1990. So it was a kind of a reusage of the old devices for the new circumstances, for the new dialogue, and it worked very well, very well. Indeed, the Neo-Chalcedonian theology constitutes the common platform for us, and it worked very well. However, the format of the dialogues, especially the pan-Orthodox dialogues, they work in the following way. The churches send their official representatives to those dialogues. Then those representatives work in the framework of the dialogues. They meet together, and they adopt sometimes communiques or common statements, like in the case of the Oriental dialogue. Then they report those. Those communiques are not binding. They don't represent the voice of the church. They don't speak on behalf of the church. They are very, in a sense, private documents, if you want, or working documents. Then the representatives of the churches communicate those communiques or declarations to the churches, to the synods. The synods then are supposed to consider those documents, to study those documents, and then they take decisions on the documents. Sometimes they accept those documents, sometimes they don't. Therefore, even though there was an agreement in Chambézy that we don't have any theological difference regarding the theology, not every church accepted those agreements. In the Orthodox, among the Byzantine churches, the Church of Alexandria, Antioch, and Romania accepted it and confirmed the declaration on the official level. Among the Oriental churches, it was again the Church of Alexandria, Antioch, and Malankara in India, which is a part of the Antiochian Church. Only those churches accepted. Why other churches did not accept? The concerns were primarily pastoral because of the rise of fundamentalists in those churches who objected against those declarations. This was the case with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Mount Athos. Well, people like Father Theodore Zisis, for instance, and Father Gregory Kapsanis from Mount Athos, they, inspired many zealots to object against those documents. The same happened in Russia. I was at the time at the Moscow Patriarchate when it was discussed, and I saw all the documents, all the discussions in the Synod, and through the Theological Commission, which at that time was led by Metropolitan Filaret of Minsk at the time. And I saw the objections, theological objections, and I realized that people just didn't understand theology of the document. I think it was the same with the Athonite monks. They just didn't understand theology. That is a huge problem. People think that they understand theology, but they don't. I would say there are not really many people who understand theology. Well, on Wednesday I'll fly to Frankfurt to a conference. It's a Christological Congress dedicated to the memory in memoriam of Cardinal Alois Grillmeyer. And there will be a dozen of people or so, which I guess is maybe half of those people in the world who understand theology behind the divide, who know the text, who know terminology and everything. Vlasios Fidas was certainly such a person who he is still alive. Thank you, thanks God, who understands this theology. But maybe a couple of dozens of people, it's my estimation, my guess, would know every detail and would really evaluate those documents. They are great documents, the Declaration of Chambézy. But one has to have knowledge to appreciate them. The Zelotic groups who objected against the documents, they didn't have and still don't have this knowledge. So that is the problem. First, lack of theological education and knowledge, which prevented the declarations to be accepted by the Church. Second thing was that even if we accept theological commonalities, if we accept that our theology is the same, the problem is, so what? So how does it is supposed to lead us to reunification, to getting back together to the same family of the churches, but it doesn't work like that. Theology used to create divisions in the late antiquity and Middle Ages. Theology played a crucial role, theological formulas. Now we still somehow believe in the magic of those formulas, that if we find a common formula, it will automatically lead us to union. But it doesn't work. These magics don't work anymore. It cannot spell the same magic that it had in the late antiquity and Middle Ages, because those theological differences that had led us to separation created identities, cultures, which cannot be easily reconciled. You can reconcile theology and theological language, but you cannot reconcile all those prejudice, cultures that piled up during the centuries, when their children, the Oriental children, were taught for centuries that from our breath of the Chalcedonians, babies die. And people in the Middle East, they were taught, the Byzantine Christians were taught the same about the Orientals. So you can, or another issue, the issue of venerating saints. For us, Severus or Dioscorus are the archi-heretics. For them, they are archi-saints. How do we do with that? How we deal with that? For this exactly reason, the dialogue established a commission and sub-commissions how to deal with those issues. The first meeting was in 1993, 3 years after the meeting of Chambézy. And they agreed to establish those commissions to discuss those pastoral issues, which seem to be more important than theological issues. The issues of identity, of common calendars, of common rituals, the way how we celebrate liturgy, and so forth. And we don't.
Want some water, Father?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you. I can survive. Actually, it didn't work well. The meeting that I participated was a preparatory meeting for discussing those pastoral issues. I think it was in Chambézy 20 in 2006. The last meeting, was in 2014 in Athens, and it doesn't work. We cannot find even a common ground among ourselves, what to discuss, how to approach those things. So those cultural things, identities, seem to be more powerful than theology nowadays. and we cannot easily overcome it. And this is a good example for us how to deal with other dialogues. What if we agree with the Catholics, for instance, about primacy? What will be next? So what? I think we will face the same sort of problems, all those cultural divisions, identities, and so forth. So this is a common problem for all dialogues, and the dialogue with the Oriental churches indicated this very well. Now, about the practical issues. Even though we disagree about theology, and there are actually, I should add to this, there are still some theological disagreements. Even though the non-Chalcedonians, and well, excuse me, coming back to the identities even further back, we call them non-Chalcedonians. We used to call them anti-Chalcedonians. They are not anymore anti-Chalcedonians because they accept the Council of Chalcedon. They accept the council with the understanding that they have, that the Council of Chalcedon had condemned Eutyches, monophysitism, and that's why it was good. So they accept Chalcedon. It is not a great deal as it is for us. I mean, it's not the best council probably that they imagined, but still they can tolerate it. That's why they are not anti-Chalcedonians. They are non-Chalcedonians, right? So about theology, we agree that Chalcedon was great, was good. They accept it. They agree that we can use both languages, two natures and one nature, depending on how we understand those languages. This is pretty much in the line with the Neo-Chalcedonian theology. They agree that Christ is doubly consubstantial with the Father and with us. They agree that his humanity, they still don't call it human nature, but they realize that his humanity was full, was not deficient, and his humanity never changed. A very important point from the Chalcedonian perspective, which differentiates our perspective from Eutyches. So they agree with everything that Chalcedon stated. There is one issue which remains, the issue of one energy. Sometimes it is not really in the focus on the radars of theologians, but we discover this in the dialogue, that it is still a sort of theologically dividing issue, because they firmly believe in the single energy of Jesus Christ, as well as in the single will of Jesus Christ, something that was discussed at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Thank you so much, Father. You're so kind. And actually, the only council they cannot digest is the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which discussed the issue of energy and will. But because the Sixth Ecumenical Council never became an identity, unlike Chalcedon, we can discuss it, and we could somehow even, put it to the margins of our theological discussions, even though we disagree on the issue of one energy. And I try personally, we somehow returned to that issue. It was a topic of my dissertation in my PhD in Britain, and we tried to discuss it, and we realized that we cannot find a sustainable agreement on this issue. But because it is not widely discussed, we just decided not to put it to the focus of our discussion. So we agree that there are no major, at least theological, disagreements. Those disagreements that had led us to separation do not exist anymore. And this allowed some churches to address pastoral issues. I mentioned that the churches of Alexandria and Antioch on both sides, Oriental and the Byzantine, agreed to, they formally approved the decision of Chambézy, which is an indication that they had very substantial pastoral concerns about the Orientals and about the division. Because de facto in the Middle East, they live as one family because they face the common challenge from Islam. They have to survive together. And they have a reality of mixed marriages, of the communities of both traditions which are served by one single priest from either Chalcedonian or non-Chalcedonian tradition. They really intertwined in the Middle East, and what the agreement of Chambézy allowed them to do is just to formalize those practices, those realities. There is only one document that I found which explicates the theological agreements of Chambézy, which puts those theological agreements to the practical plane. This is a common letter, common statement, which was made by two patriarchs, the Patriarch Ignatius IV of memory of the late Patriarch Ignatius from the Byzantine tradition, and Patriarch Ignatius Zaka from the Oriental tradition, from the Syriac Church. They signed together in 1991 a statement which is a great document. And that is the only document, as I said, which deals with the practical issues and which can be a guide for us, for other churches. Let me mention some points from this document. They state that both churches shall refrain from accepting any faithful from one church into the membership of the other church, irrespective of all motivations or reasons. It means that they recognize the full ecclesiality in the other group and don't need to accept into their own church people who want to join them, because they don't see any deficiency in the ecclesial deficiency in the other group, in the other side. Okay. Then they encourage meetings between the two churches at the level of their synods. So they encourage the members of the synod to meet together. I don't think it ever happened, but nevertheless they agreed to have such meetings. They also indicated that every church will remain the reference and authority for its faithful pertaining to matters of personal status like marriage, divorce, adoption, etc. If bishops of the two churches participate at a holy baptism or funeral service, the one belonging to the church of the baptized or deceased will preside. In case of a holy matrimony service, the bishop of the bridegroom's church will preside. So it's a bit sexist, certainly, but it's the Middle East. But this means that the common participation of bishops, not just priests, but bishops in the sacraments is possible. And they can share participation in sacraments. There is a remark that this does not apply to the Divine Liturgy. However, we will come back. We will come later to the Holy Liturgy. And they also say that what applies to bishops equally applies to the priests of both churches, which means that priests can participate in the sacraments together. Then, in localities where there is only one priest from either church, he will celebrate services for the faithful of both churches, including the Divine Liturgy. Not just baptism or marriage. Liturgy can be celebrated for a congregation or for two congregations when there is only one priest, which means Eucharistic hospitality. This priest will keep an independent record for each church and transmit that of the sister church to its authorities. If two priests of the two churches happen to be in a locality where there is only one church, they take turns in making use of its facilities. So it means that they can use the same church for their communities interchangeably. If a bishop from one church and a priest from the sister church happen to concelebrate a service, the first will preside even when it is the priest's parish. You see? So they describe the situation when there is a liturgy and a bishop comes to that liturgy from one tradition, say a Byzantine bishop. And then a priest comes from the Oriental church, and it happens that the community is Oriental. Then the bishop, the Byzantine bishop, will preside over that liturgy. However, ordinations into the holy orders are performed by the authorities of each church for its own members. So no ordination to priesthood, to be shared. However, it would be advisable to invite the faithful of the sister church to attend such ordination. Godmothers in baptism and witnesses in holy matrimony can be chosen from the members of the sister church. So a full kind of sharing in the sacrament of baptism. So this is the document which was adopted officially by the Church of Antioch, which reflects the pastoral realities of the Church of Antioch. To my understanding, even though there are no official kind of letters regarding this, the same is practiced in the Church of Alexandria in Egypt, but not very much in other churches which don't face the same kind of problems. However, because the situation in the Church of Antioch or Egypt, in the Middle East in other words, happens also in the diaspora, probably this could be a guideline for the churches in the diaspora, but still I think it is left to the discretion of a local bishop always to decide which model to adopt. But this is, I think, this is an important example how an indication how it can be done in the local communities. So these are the pastoral kind of implications of the theological and ecclesial and cultural developments in the Christian East that affect our families. And I'll be happy to answer questions if I have any answer to your questions.
Father, two things, Father, for the Cyril. The first is that you were discussing this document now that pertains to two churches.
Yes, the Church of Antioch.
And Alexandria, you said.
Yes, exactly. Well, the official document applies only to the Church of Antioch because it was
Only
signed
to
by,
the
yes,
Church of Antioch.
the Church of Alexandria, to my understanding, to my knowledge, never issued such a guideline. But the practice is approximately the same in Egypt and in Syria.
So, but the Ecumenical Patriarchate never accepted this kind of...
No, the Ecumenical Patriarchate never objected against this, but never adopted a document, a similar document. No,
a policy
no. I know that the Ecumenical Patriarchate completely supported the decisions of Chambézy, the declaration of Chambézy, but faced the rebukement from the Zelotic groups, particularly in Mount Athos, that prevented the Ecumenical Patriarchate from, I think, from adopting a formal guideline.
In your knowledge, do you know any kind of movement within the Ecumenical Patriarchate that they want to revisit this issue?
Yes.
Because
yeah.
it trickles down to the practicality.
Exactly. Well, the dialogue continues in a sense, even though it closed its work, its theological work, it continues in the practical issues. And the Orthodox Byzantine co-chair of the Diocese Metropolitan Emmanuel of Paris, of France, I think it is very much, he's a devoted person to this dialogue. He certainly supports all the issues, well, the declaration and so forth. I think it is still being discussed in the Ecumenical Patriarchate which exactly guidelines to apply. The practice of the Church of Moscow, even though the Church of Moscow did not accept the declaration of Chambézy, again, because of the reasons they just didn't understand theology behind that. I just read those documents and realized that, those discussions in the Theological Commission, I realized they just missed the point, or just acknowledged that we cannot discuss it. We don't know this. And I just briefly respond to this. And nevertheless, the practice of the Church of Moscow in the parishes, like in Europe, I know, they allow Copts, Ethiopians, Syrians to come to the church and they give them communion. That is the...
In Moscow?
Well, the church, the Russian church in diaspora, in Europe, and I think in the U.S. as well. So that is the practice. So there are no official documents except the document of Antioch. But the practices de facto is that they actually accept the practices, follow the agreement of Chambézy.
Well, one more, then I'm going to ask my brothers if they have it. When we're talking about Oriental churches,
Yeah.
can you name them?
Yes, certainly. I'm sorry that I didn't do this in the beginning. So they are less than our churches. They are Coptic church. The Coptic church embraced all the Northern Africa, used to produce all the Northern Africa, and it was actually the largest church in Egypt. When the Great Schism #1 happened in the 5th century, the church was divided into halves. On the one side, the Chalcedonian side, there was the Church of Constantinople and Rome with the tiny enclave of Jerusalem, and on the other side, there were the Church of Antioch and Alexandria in Egypt. Two halves. And then the Byzantine churches, we just planted parallel structures in, which were tiny in Egypt and Syria. So the Coptic church is #1. It had also the Ethiopian church included. The Ethiopian church became independent in the 20th century under the insistence of the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie. It became autocephalous, even though it was not really recognized by the Coptic church. And the Ethiopian church is the largest in the Oriental family. It has, I think, the estimation is that they have approximately 80 million people of their members in Ethiopia. Then, when Eritrea split from Ethiopia, they had a war. The Eritrean church separated from the Ethiopian church. It became schismatic to the Ethiopian church, but was acknowledged by the Coptic church. Well, you understand the rationale probably. Yes. Then the Syrian church, the second ancient kind of Oriental church, which is based in Western Syria, Byzantine Western Syria, with the center of Antioch. And the Syrian church also has its branches, particularly in India. In India, it has two branches. One Indian church, Malankara church, which is a part of the Syrian church, and another church which is autocephalous, which is independent from the Syrian church. They have problems among them, but still, well, they exist as such churches. And the Armenian church, which is also separated into two parts. The Armenian church had its own historical journey. There are some slight theological differentiation between the Armenian church and other Oriental churches. The Armenians, they embarked on the theology of Julian Halicarnassus, who was a heretic for the Orientals because he supported the teaching of orthodoxism, that the flesh of Jesus was not corrupted. So the Armenians had their own journey. There was a period when they were iconoclasts, for instance, but eventually they kind of reunited with the rest of the Oriental church. And in the 20th century, they became separated into parts because of the genocide. So when the Armenians suffered from the genocide in the beginning of the 20th century, and those who survived had to flee, some of them went to what they call Eastern Armenia, with the center of Echmiadzin, where is their center. The other part of Armenians who survived fled to the Lebanon and established their own center in Antelias. It's a suburb of Beirut. So they have two Catholicoi. The Catholicos is a title of a patriarch who was outside the Byzantine Empire. So within the Byzantine Empire, the primates were patriarchs, outside were Catholicoi. That's why we have, for instance, we have even Byzantine Catholicos, like in Georgia, Catholicos Elias. He is Catholicos because the Georgian church for a long time belonged to the Persian Empire outside the Byzantine world. So the Armenians have two Catholicoi. One is in Echmiadzin and another one is in Beirut. The Catholicos in Echmiadzin is regarded superior to the Catholicos in Beirut. They also have a patriarch in Istanbul, which is a kind of rudiment, a remnant of the Ottoman system of millets. You know, the Orthodox people, Christians in the Ottoman Empire, were divided to millets, kind of religious and then ethnic groups. And they had an ethnarch, in the Millet who reported to the High Port. So the ecumenical patriarch reported for the Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox in the Ottoman Empire, for the Armenians, and actually for all Orientals, who constituted the so-called Millet Armenian, which included Syrians and so forth. Report for them, the ethnarch was the patriarch in Istanbul. There is still a patriarch in Istanbul, but his importance is really tiny. He's not really an important figure. So there are two Armenian churches with two primates in Echmiadzin and Beirut. So that is the system of the Oriental churches. Yes, please.
The Armenian, in many cases, the Armenian church, I've experienced where they, and you brought this up in your talk, where they have some sense of intercommunion between their own districts. Yeah. And from their point of view, they come for Holy Communion. When they come to our church, my understanding is that in their minds, they can receive communion because we are. Yeah. But now in our minds, where do we stand?
Yes.
That's the first thing. And the second thing I wanted to ask is, the Coptics have been martyred by ISIS.
Yeah. In Libya.
Is there a common sense among all Orthodox that they are saintly or saints?
Yeah.
For having given their lives to Christ?
Yeah. Well, thank you for these questions. Regarding Armenians, if we talk about the Eucharistic hospitality, Armenians are the most hospitable among all of us. They don't care who comes to the chalice. I saw when I participated, in the dialogues in the Echmiadzin, in the liturgy celebrated by the Catholicos. He stated, and the members of the dialogue, they were, Anglicans, Catholics. He said, well, everyone is welcome. Come to the chalice. He officially invited, Catholics, Anglicans, and so forth to participate in the Eucharist, and they project the same idea to us. They think that we would be behaving in the same way. I think it is, we don't have officially Eucharistic communion with them. And as we saw in the Church of Antioch, it is practiced. In the Church of Alexandria, it is practiced. As for other churches, it is left to the discretion of a bishop to what to do with whether to give communion to those people, to the Armenians. As for the second question, could you remind?
The Coptic.
Yes, the martyrs. Well, I haven't heard any act of reception from the Byzantine Orthodox regarding their martyrdom. I don't think they are really equally venerated as martyrs even within the Oriental family, because, as I said, it is more loose. It is looser than our family. And they are really venerated in the Coptic Church. But it will take some time, their veneration to spread first within the Oriental family and outside the Oriental family. I don't see personally, I think I would pray to them, certainly. I believe that they are saints, but it is a matter of acceptance by the church.